Transcendentalism is an American literary, political, and philosophical movement of the early 19th century, so the 1800s, centered around the life, work, and thoughts of Ralph Waldo Emerson, like I mentioned. Other important transcendentalists were Henry David Thoreau, who you've heard me talk quite a bit about, Margaret Fuller, Amos Bronson Alcott, a bunch of folks, lots and lots of folks. So their philosophy was rooted in the belief that each individual could transcend or move beyond, so transcend, move beyond, the physical world of the senses into deeper spiritual experience through free will and intuition. So moving beyond the senses, transcending the senses, not forgetting the senses, but moving through the senses with the senses through free will and intuition. In this way, they believed that people could find a deeper connection with the universe, with each other, with other living things, with nature, and with their own selves, their own souls. Now, let's unpack that just a little bit. So, at its heart, Transcendentalism teaches that truth is not handed down by institutions, but discovered within each person. Emerson believed that every person can access spiritual truth directly through intuition and moral conscience, which I've mentioned already. Truth is not confined to scripture or dogma for transcendentalists. Instead, it arises when the soul becomes aware of its own sacred depth. It arises when the soul becomes aware of its own sacred depth. To know truth is to listen inwardly and trust that same force, or source, whatever you want to call it, that moves through the stars. And that same source that moves through the stars also moves through the self, which is pretty incredible to think about. Now, the Transcendentalists saw nature as a living revelation of the sacred. For them, the forest, the pond, the sky were not just symbols of the sacred, although they were that, but they were expressions, actual physical expressions of the sacred. Emerson called nature the symbol of the spirit, and Thoreau treated the woods and seasons as scripture in themselves. When we walk in nature with attention, we enter a dialogue with the sacred and remember who we are. This is why Thoreau spent so much time in the woods doing what he did and writing it down. Now, they also taught that all life is one. And now we're getting into some important transcendentalist theology here. So Emerson named this shared essence, remember, taught that life is one, named this shared essence the oversoul, which is a term that I'm not fond of, but that's okay. So this oversoul is the universal life that flows through all beings. The universal life, sacred source, whatever you want to call it. Some people call it God, some people don't call it God. Now, what I want you to do is lean in right now, because this is important. I'm going to give you the heart, the very heart of why the Transcendentalist movement despised slavery and all other forms of social injustice in the 19th century, when it was okay in America to not despise this stuff. So Emerson believed that when we entertain the idea that the sacred with a capital S moves, exists, speaks, flows through every single living, breathing soul on this planet, we can no longer believe in superiority or domination. To harm another, whoever, whatever that other is to harm the sacred itself, to harm the divine itself. To see the infinite in every person, in everything, in all of nature is to make justice not a choice, but a spiritual necessity. This right here is the heart of transcendentalist social reform in America, and it was very, very influential. So for the Transcendentalist, awakening was never meant to stay private. It was not a private function. It was not a private thing. Spiritual insight demanded social courage. So Thoreau withdrew to Walden Pond to learn to live deliberately, but he also refused to pay taxes that supported slavery and war. Margaret Fuller turned deep religious, mystical insights into a fierce call for women's equality. Theodore Parker, another big name in the Transcendentalist movement, grounded in the same vision, preached against slavery with prophetic fire, deep prophetic fire. Now listen, the ideals that shape Unitarian Universalism, human dignity, the authority of conscience, reverence for nature, and commitment to justice, come directly from this Transcendentalist heritage. Emerson, Thoreau, Fuller, Parker, all of these folks saw religion not as belief in doctrine, but as an awakening to the sacred in all things. Probably the boldest transcendentalist claim is that each person is an infinite soul. Within us is infinity. This soul is not private or separate. It is a point of connection to the larger whole. You hearing this? This soul is not private or separate. It is a point of connection to the larger whole. When Emerson first read the Hindu scriptures, the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita, it completely blew the walls off his inherited Christianity. These texts spoke of sacred reality, divine reality, Brahman, B-R-A-H-M-A-N, Brahman. And this reality wasn't somewhere else, but was the ground of everything. So not just separate and away from humanity, but the ground of humanity. These Hindu scriptures taught that the self, the Atman, A-T-M-A-N, the Atman, is not separate from the sacred source, not at all separate from the divine source. To know yourself, then, this is the conclusion, to know yourself is to know the sacred. To know yourself is to know the sacred, because we are expressions of the sacred, we are part of the sacred, we tap into that infinite infinity. Emerson took that and completely ran with it. It changed his life. He really, really, really locked onto that idea and believed it. In his journals, he wrote about a unity within that's deeper than any creed, a pulse that beats through every living thing. God, he said, isn't a ruler above, but a presence within. The breath that moves through the trees, the thought behind your thoughts, the moral law that stirs in the heart when you do what you know is right. He turned what was theology into living experience. And this insight became the backbone of Transcendentalism. If the sacred lives in you, then there's no church or king that can stand between you and the truth. As I mentioned, Emerson called it the oversoul. Again, not a term that I like, but the idea came right out of Hinduism. This is important to note, I think. Everything alive is made of the same spirit. That is right out of Hinduism. This wasn't abstract philosophy for him. For Emerson, it was complete liberation. It shattered the old hierarchies of religion, race, and gender, which was very important for this time in American history. If Atman and Brahman are one, the self and the source of all selves are one, then every human being carries that sacred equally. Carries that sacred equally. That's why Emerson's mysticism led to moral courage. It made injustice a kind of blasphemy, which is pretty brilliant and very liberating and very moving, I think. So the Transcendentalist doesn't bow to power. They listen inwardly and act from that center, knowing that the same light that burns in the stars, as I mentioned before, also lives and burns somehow within us too, because we are made of the same stuff. Here's some of the American political legacy. So Emerson's vision didn't stay in the woods and lecture halls. It helped shape American democracy. And I want you to deeply, deeply, deeply recognize that my broader argument here is that Hinduism played a major role in the development of American thought and democracy. Emerson reimagined politics as a moral enterprise. In Emerson's 1844 essay called Politics, he wrote that every actual state is corrupt, meaning that no government can stand above conscience. No one has that authority. No one has that ability. No one has that knowledge. True reform, he said, begins in the moral awakening of individuals who act from within. That conviction, that conscience, is the highest law, became the ethical foundation for abolition, for women's rights and suffrage, and later for multiple civil rights movements. Now, Emerson also transformed how America imagined a democracy itself. For Emerson, democracy was not just a political system, but a spiritual revelation. The recognition that each person carries the divine, carries the sacred. This was a big deal, right? So he saw the nation as a living experiment in moral growth, a society meant to cultivate the inner freedom of the soul. Now, by the 1850s, Emerson's Transcendentalism, which I've been talking about here, had turned much more from meditation to moral fire. It was starting to catch, right? Emerson did a lot of speaking and writing, and this moral fire started to catch. As the nation split over slavery, he declared that the end of all political struggle is to establish morality as the basis for all legislation. Slavery, he said, was not an institution, but a destitution, a disease of the spirit. And he was leaning on Hindu theology as he was making these claims. In 1862, he met Abraham Lincoln, and found not a backwoods politician he had imagined, but a sincere and thoughtful man guided by conscience, which is very important for Emerson. For a brief moment, the philosopher and the president met eye to eye, both believing that democracy was not just government, but moral destiny. You see, when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Emerson saw it as the moral awakening of the entire nation, the moment when conscience finally took the shape of law. And Lincoln wasn't just influenced by Emerson. He was influenced by Theodore Parker, by many of his associates around him who had been privy to Transcendentalist philosophy. So Lincoln was definitely thinking this way. His words, Emerson's words, and Lincoln's deed had met in history. And 2 years later, as the nation was mourning Abraham Lincoln, Emerson spoke of him as a plain man of the people. A plain man of the people, whose greatness came from integrity and not ambition. In Lincoln, Emerson's theologically Hindu transcendentalism found its living proof. Together, these two men and many other people, men and women alike, showed that the soul of democracy is the sacred worth of every human being. Did you hear what I said? That is about as Unitarian Universalist as you can get. Now, are you recognizing just how influential our Unitarian Universalist ancestors were in the parts of the foundational philosophy of this nation? And do you see how Hinduism's Eastern philosophy provides much of the backbone for philosophy in America? Isn't that interesting? That is so interesting. And as Unitarian Universalists, we have this legacy to visit and revisit again and again in order to find spiritual nourishment to sustain the difficult work of justice ahead, the difficult work of justice right now. And you know what I'm talking about. The good news is that Transcendentalist spirituality worked once before to change the heart of a nation bent on divisiveness. And I think it can do it again. So this is Transcendentalism's living message to us, to recognize the infinite within ourselves and others, to recognize the infinite within ourselves and others, to honor nature as holy, and to act from conscience, even when it challenges comfort or power. Every moment of deep perception is a glimpse of the sacred. To live from that truth is to help make the world whole. And I'm hoping you understand what that means at this point in this video. So finally, Transcendentalist spirituality insists that awakening must become action. Awakening must become action. Thoreau, Parker, and Fuller did not separate meditation from resistance. Likewise, our task right now is to join inner clarity with public courage, to speak truth, defend democracy, and refuse to let despair harden into apathy. To live as a Transcendentalist, Unitarian Universalist today is to trust conscience over conformity, reverence over fear, and interdependence over domination. It is to remember that the sacred within us cannot be ruled.